Yeah, so our next speaker is Professor Thomas Funkhouser. Tom is a professor emeritus at the Computer Science Department of Princeton University, and now he is working at Google Research. Tom has been a leading figure in computer graphics and computer vision. He is among the first researchers to identify the importance of creating large-scale benchmarks of 3D models and shapes. And from his early work of the Princeton Shape Benchmark to the more recent ShapeNet, his research has been influencing these fields for many decades. And these days, he has also produced a number of impactful and award-winning papers in robotic grasping and manipulation. And to me, it has always been a pleasure to read Tom's paper, since they will bring you both intellectual inspirations as well as the great visual enjoyments. I guess that is a bonus of being an expert in both computer graphics and robotics. I can't wait for his talk. Let's welcome Tom.
All right, thank you very much. You can hear me okay, and you can see my slides? Yes?
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about spatial action maps. The motivating goal for this project is to train robots that perform mobile manipulation tasks. So this is not all tasks in robotics, but ones where you must move to a location and perform an action there. So on the left with bin picking, you might move the end effector to a particular location and perform sort of grasping action. In the right, you might navigate for the goal of collecting a set of objects. And they share the property that they require movement and performing an action at locations. So I'm going to refine that a little bit. We're not only going to train robots to do novel manipulation tests, but we're going to do that with deep reinforcement learning. So I'm not considering cases where you build a model or you map out the entire space and then you do planning and so on and so forth. We're going to use deep reinforcement learning in these particular systems. And I'm going to refine it even further by saying that we're going to consider only cases where the input to the network is a map or an image. So in the case shown here, the input is, I call it state, but really it's a top-down view of the bin that is seen from some sort of camera. And so the state is represented as a map. And this is limiting, of course. Not all problems can be represented that way, but many can. So bin picking, for example, or navigation, self-driving cars, surveillance. There's lots of applications where the state or even the raw input is an image representing some sort of location at every pixel. So that's the domain in which I'm working here. So the focus within that domain is going to be on action representations. So there are many possible action representations that you can have for a particular task. There are many people who ask the question, what is the right action representation? In fact, there's even a whole workshop at this conference on that topic. I'm going to give my own take on that and provide some high-level thoughts about action representations and then propose a particular one for particular kinds of tasks, and we'll see where we go from there. So my high-level thoughts are that we're going to use a deep neural network to go from, I'm going to call it state to action. And we think of deep neural networks as these really powerful functions that can go from any input to any input and can learn any mapping. But it's not really true. Deep neural networks are really good at predicting some kinds of functions and not so good at others, or at least learning to predict. And the training efficiency can be greatly affected by what the parameterization of the inputs and the outputs are. And if the mapping from the inputs to outputs is too difficult, then the deep neural network tends to memorize and interpolate rather than to learn the underlying function, partly due, probably due to the limitations of the optimization of the weights. They get stuck in a local minimum that is easy to find, just memorize and interpolate, which is much harder than learning a really complicated function. So when picking an action representation, we want to be aware of what the capabilities of a deep neural network are and pick inputs and outputs that aren't too difficult to learn. So generally speaking, in my experience, deep neural networks are amazing at recognizing local patterns in images. Learning filters basically that light up pixels that have particular characteristics. So if I have a fully connected network, there's semantic segmentation. I can learn to recognize where the eyes are, or the ears, or so on and so forth, or the cats. They're also good at classifying images. If I have an image and I want to detect what kind of class it is, dog versus cat, for example, they're very good at that. What they're not good at is abstracting abstract parameters from an image. So even the simple task of taking a one-hot image where background's black and one pixel is white, and the task is output the XY position of that pixel, they're amazingly bad at that because it requires a very complicated mapping that is difficult to learn. And it's even worse if that function requires cosines and sines and many nonlinear functions. And so we're going to try to avoid that. And yet, there are many people who use what I'm going to call either classes or abstract mappings for mobile manipulation tasks. So if we just look at some navigation systems, pretty much all of them go from some sort of state or observation as an image to steering commands, where the commands might be move forward, move backwards, turn right, turn left, straight, things like that. And I'm going to put that in the second or third category, where you're learning to go from pixels to some abstract thing that has to be memorized or recognized, which seems very difficult. So an example of that, just picking one example, would be the paper by Saurabh Gupta in 2017, where there's a very beautiful method for differentiably building a map of the space, and then the differentiable planner goes from that map to the steering command actions. And again, I'm focusing on this differentiable planner part of that, where I believe that mapping is kind of difficult. So instead, in this work, we're going to propose spatial action maps, where the representation of the actions is not an abstract set of classes or regressing navigation steering commands, but rather is a dense pixel-aligned, pixel-to-pixel value of performing an action at each location in the map. So in the left, the map is such that every pixel represents a location in physical space. And so then spatial action maps are potentially a stack of images, pixel aligned to the state, such that the meaning of any pixel in the spatial action map is go to that location and perform the action represented by the map at that position. The beauty of this is that we're now in the first category of what fully convolutional networks are good at, which is recognizing patterns in images, local patterns in images, and they can be computed directly with a fully convolutional network that goes from pixels to pixels. And so that's basically the overall idea of what we're trying to achieve here. Okay, and just to make that more concrete, if we compare spatial action maps versus steering commands for, say, a navigation application, is that, again, I'm repeating myself, there's a complex mapping from states to steering commands, whereas for spatial action maps, it's a direct pixel-wise mapping from states to actions. For steering commands, another thing is that you can only reach a small set of nearby endpoints with each action. If your steering commands are, say, go forward, go backwards, turn right, turn left, the set of states that you can reach with any given action is limited to those four, and they're all very close to where you are. And so a long string of actions is required in order to achieve a significantly long-range goal. In our spatial action maps, the meaning of every pixel is go here and do an action. And the go here can be actually a complex action. So in particular, we follow shortest paths through reconstructed spatial maps. So the green curve on the bottom right is an example of a single action that if you chose the pixel in the spatial action map represented by the green X, then the action would be follow that dotted line from your start point, which is where the dot is. And as opposed, so that's one action. Whereas if you did that with steering commands, you'd need a sequence of lots of actions, which would be hard to learn with reinforcement learning. So, for these reasons, we believe that spatial action maps are going to be more sample efficient to learn in reinforcement learning than with steering commands. Okay, so this is work that's inspired by previous work on dense affordance maps for grasping, and a system by Andy Zangedel and MIT Princeton as part of the Amazon Robotics Challenge. The affordance maps, which are very similar to spatial action maps, were used to predict the value, not the Q value, but the value of every place in a bin pecking setting, where the red points here are where good grasp are, and it would choose the best one with a fully convolutional network, just like we are using. And then in the follow-up work to that, it was put in a reinforcement learning setting where Q values were represented in each of these output maps. And so there's a Q value for performing a push action and a Q value for performing a grasp action at every location. And again, fully convolutional networks are used to predict them. So spatial action maps is building upon this approach that was inspired by this previous work in grasping. So the rest of this talk will focus on a paper that is going to be presented at this conference on Wednesday, and it was done by Jimmy Wu in a collaboration between Princeton and Google. So the task targeted in this particular paper is to train robots to push objects into receptacles. This task was chosen for a few reasons. One is, it seems like it's a real task in that when you're raking leaves or picking up trash or things like that, it's something you might want to do. And it's also sufficiently complex that handcrafted policies would seem difficult to achieve. And so reinforcement learning seems like a good candidate for learning policies that are able to do this job. So in our setup, there is a little Anki robot that is pushing objects, these little blocks, into a receptacle. And so the state starts with that robot at some particular position. There's not 3 robots, there's only 1 robot, and the gray levels represent time. And the robot moves around, and wherever it decides to go, it may push a block, and if it reaches the receptacle, then that's a success. And so the goal is to learn a policy that will, you choose navigation commands such that all the blocks end up in the receptacle. And again, it's not an easy task. You got to learn to go around the backside of an object and push it back towards the receptacle rather than just like find the objects or something like that. Okay, so we're going to train a system to do this in a deep reinforcement learning setting. It's very typical. The environment is, again, a robot with a set of blocks. There are obstacles that we'll consider different environments, some of which are quite challenging, like this one shown on the left, where there's a little gap between 2 separate areas. We're going to build a state that represents that environment, run it through a fully convolutional network to produce our spatial action maps, pick the action shown by the white cross here that has the highest Q value, and then apply that action. We're going to iterate through that. In the next few slides, I'm going to describe each of the state, action, and reward in more detail. So first, the state. So given an environment, our first step is to do some sort of online mapping to build an occupancy map of where obstacles are. This is not a global map that that is provided by the system. This is the aggregation of observations for this robot over time. And so the black areas are unobserved, and you don't know whether there's an obstacle there or not because you've never been there. Okay. And then we're going to build a state from that, which is a multi-channel image where the channels represent different aspects that you can compute from that occupancy map. So specifically, we're going to give the system the occupancy map, but we're also going to compute a shortest path through the occupancy map from the agent's position. So shortest paths can be computed very efficiently with a Dijkstra kind of algorithm, order n log n, and the number of pixels that you want to compute. It's a one-to-many kind of computation. And so we'll perform that on the pixels of the occupancy map to produce channels that are part of our state, which are estimated shortest path from our agent to each position in the map, and shortest path from the receptacle to each position in the map, which we believe are going to be channels that are useful to the system. So it's more specifically, the channels are provided to the system in a robot-aligned local region. So the robot is not always in the middle when we provide these local maps as the representation to this, as the state for the input to the network, where there are 4 channels. One is the dot in the middle that says this is the robot position. Second is the occupancy map, and then the shortest path channels. These shortest path channels are actually quite interesting. It's really subtle. It seems like a hack. It seems like a thing that we're handcrafting something that's specific to this task. But I think they're generally useful for any navigation task, or really, for a wide variety of tasks. They're just a useful channel to have. But they're more to the point, an instance of a more general problem, which is how do you combine the results of simulation into a learning framework? So clearly understanding shortest paths or unobstructed paths through an environment is useful for this task, or for many tasks. But you don't want to build a policy that picks a location and then after the fact tries to figure out whether you can get there or not. And so instead of doing that, what we do is we provide the results of simulation. So in this case, it's just a simple shortest path algorithm, but it could be any result of any simulation as an input to the network. And the beauty of that is that the network can decide whether or not it's useful or not. Yes, we handcrafted those channels, but we're not handcrafting how the network uses those channels. It can completely ignore them if it wants. And so you could give it tons and tons of channels that you think might be useful, and the network will decide what is and isn't. So it's a very general way to mix simulation and learning. Okay, so that was the state. So now we're going to talk about our action representation. So I already said that in this system, we're going to use actions that are represented as an image, or a pixel-wise map. And the result of choosing an action in any pixel is moved to the location in world space that is represented by that ij pixel. And specifically, we're going to move along shortest paths through the current occupancy map. So the blue lines here show all the different paths that are possible from the current robot location if you chose different pixels. And you notice they're not straight lines, which makes it so that you can perform pretty complicated actions by just choosing a single action. This also points out an interesting thing, which is that we've broken the problem of going from observation to action into 2. One that's producing these kind of high-level actions, go there, and 2, which is requiring a controller to actually achieve that action. So, of course, we're not predicting voltages that would be applied to motors to make all this happen, but instead we're assuming that there's going to be a lower-level controller that's going to execute these actions for us. And so this only can be applied, of course, when such a controller is possible. But again, I think there's a wide class of problems where there's such a thing as possible. Okay. To be clear, the difference between these actions and steering, I've already said this, is that steering commands can only do local things in small steps, whereas spatial action maps can have any kind of action that you decide to take, of which following the shortest path is just one example. Okay, And then last, we have a reward in our reinforcement learning system that's pretty straightforward. So you get a full reward for finally getting an object into the receptacle. We also add a partial reward for moving an object closer to the receptacle, which we find helps with training. It isn't usually absolutely required for training in most examples, but it certainly helps move things along quicker. And then there's a penalty for colliding with the walls. Okay, and then we train the system in the usual DQN setup, where our goal is to find a policy that selects the actions that maximize the Q function. The Q function is expected future reward plus the current reward. We use a very standard value iteration updates with double DQN, and then we train it with using a replay buffer with 10,000 states in the replay buffer. And we use greedy strategies for random examples or generalization. Okay, so now we have a system and a way to train it. So to our experiments that we run in 4 different environments of different complexities. So I'm going to start with some simulation results where we can measure how well things are going. And then I'll show you some real examples later. So our test environments include ones that are kind of small and do not have obstacles. And then the middle 2 have block-shaped obstacles, which are shown in gray. And then the last one has a large divider, and there's only a small gap on the left between the 2 regions. And the receptacle is always in the top right. And so these are increasing difficulty to learn because you, for example, on the one on the right, you've got to learn to go through that little gap. Okay. And then the way that we test this is that for each environment type, we train for 6,000 transitions, which is usually several hundred episodes, where each episode is a random initialization of the environment. So it's not always the same environment. It's the same environment of the site, but the obstacles might be different places. The wall that goes through the middle might be of different size or position. The blocks are in different positions. The robot start stays in different, so on and so forth. So for each episode, it's initialized randomly and operates until all the blocks are in the receptacle or until there's 100 steps where no more blocks have gone. Okay, and at test time, we train 5 different policies, each for 20 episodes with each of the policies, and then we average across the 5 policies. We average across the 20 episodes for each policy and then across the policies. And again, each of those is initialized randomly. And then our evaluation metrics are to count how many blocks were pushed into the receptacle for each episode. And then we also look at that as a function of travel distance to measure something about sample efficiency. Okay, so here are some videos of results. These are qualitative results where they're sped up, of course, significantly, where you can get a sense of what the robots are doing. The black robot is moving around and it's pushing these yellow blocks into the receptacle. Cool. If we look quantitatively at some of these things and compare the impact of our spatial action maps to what you would get if you trained a similar system with steering commands, it's significant difference. So the table here has numbers of mean number of objects pushed into the receptacle plus their standard deviation using our spatial action maps versus if we were to train the same thing with steering commands. And the steering commands, I mean, essentially it's just very difficult to learn this difficult task because it takes a long series of steps in order to get useful rewards. And the mapping from a steering command to from the image state to the steering command is very abstract. Whereas in the spatial action map, the simplest thing that the network can learn is basically recognize where the objects are and say go there. And so it's already very easy for it to learn an almost already useful policy. Okay, if we were to take out aspects of our system and perform ablations where instead of following shortest paths the method follows straight line paths, or if we were to follow small fixed size steps, the same size as the steering commands, we find that the spatial action maps still are significantly better than steering commands. They're not as good as the full system with both of those things enabled, but they're still significantly better than steering commands. And again, it's because the recognizing where is a useful place to go is already just very easy with this kind of representation for the actions. Okay, if we look at the agent performance on just the most difficult environment, the large divider environment, we find that the agents are far more productive much earlier on than they would be with steering commands. And then if we look qualitatively at some of the paths taken by the agent, you can see that these shortest path actions shown on the left in our method are just very useful to, to travel, through the small door, for example. Once the occupancy map has seen enough of the environment to understand that there's a small door there, then all actions, can immediately utilize that knowledge to visit things on the other side of the barrier. Whereas with straight actions in the middle or steering commands, it's much more difficult. And the pattern up in the left of the steering commands basically is showing that the steering commands are not really learning very useful behaviors. If we were to look at sample efficiency during training, it's the same story where the blue curve is ours and the red curve is steering commands, and our method fairly quickly learns useful behaviors, whereas with steering commands, it takes much longer. And again, it's because every step is short and the mapping is difficult. I guess it's possible that if we trained for much longer, the red curve would approach where the blue curve is, but I don't know, because I think it would have taken too long for us to find that out. We also studied what would have happened if we hadn't given these extra channels into the state, where we find that in particular, they're really useful in the complex environments like the large divider environment, because they allow the network to know if I went to this location, how long would it take me to get there? Of course, it's not possible because it's not perfect, because these shortest paths are through the current occupancy map, which may not be perfect, might not even be correct, but uses those channels to great advantage. Okay, and then we also tested the system on some real world examples. So here's some very simple short videos of the robot learning to go around the backside of an object and push it into the receptacle. To produce these videos, we trained only in simulation and then ran the policy directly on the real world environment using an overhead camera to capture the state. Here's an example of the robot pushing objects against the wall. And that's significant because one of the emerging behaviors that it learns is to first push all the objects against the wall and then push them all into the receptacle. That probably is related to where the receptacle is in this example, but it's very neat that it learns to do that. So essentially, the beginning of the episode, it's just crisscrossing through the middle, pushing everything against the side, and then later coming through and sweeping them all into the receptacle, which is very cool. And similarly, it has to learn how to get them through the corners. The corners are a little sticky in this particular environment, and so they can get stuck there. And so it's got to learn behaviors that push them around corners, which it seems to do. Okay, and then the last part of this is that the inference time for these spatial action maps is quite quick. So generating the state in PyBullet in our simulations or in the real system with cameras takes a little bit of time, not the shortest path, but just generating the state and then rendering it. But the actual inference to produce the spatial action map from the state takes only 5 milliseconds. in our implementation. And it's because it's just a forward pass to a fully convolutional network. And so it can be quite quick. And then after that, of course, you just have to look at every pixel and pick the maximum. Okay, so to summarize, I talked about spatial action maps. The idea is to represent actions not as abstract commands like steering commands or joint angles or torques or voltages or things like that, but to represent the actions that are output by a deep network as a set of pixels that are one-to-one aligned with the state, or whatever the input to the network is. And so then it can learn pixel-to-pixel mapping directly with the deep network, which is exactly what deep networks are good at. This kind of action is appropriate for robot applications where actions are performed at locations, like do that there kind of applications, which again could include grasping or navigation or things like that. And then an advantage of doing this is that they're inferred efficiently with fully connected networks. This is in contrast to, say, if you made proposals, cropped out images and then ran a network on each of the proposals. Here we're computing all the Q values for all possible actions all at once in one pass through the network. In this particular mobile manipulation application that I showed, the actions represent shortest paths through an occupancy map. And these additional state channels that are the results of simple simulations help the network make long-range decisions, which is very useful. Of course, spatial action maps are not useful for all tasks in robotics. They're appropriate for ones where the actions can be parameterized by positions aligned with the state, and where states can be encoded as images, where the pixels represent locations in the real world, and patterns in the states reveal valuable actions. So in the picture below, the goal is to pick up all the blocks in a bin picking kind of setting, tabletop bin picking setting, where the state here is a height map, and then each of the blue things on the right shows the Q value of either pushing or grasping at that location when the gripper is oriented in one of 16 orientations. And so just a single pass with this fully convolutional network produces these Q maps of which you pick the best one, and this is an example that does meet these requirements. As I said before, they're only appropriate when you can go from these action maps to actual physical actions, which may require having a controller that infers joint angles and torques and voltages and things like that. Okay, and so then in future work, I think the interesting question, or an interesting question, is what is the range of tasks that can leverage spatial action maps? I already talked a little bit about grasping and navigation, but what else? So then people have started to use representations similar to this for navigation and habitat-like environments, where it's a first-person ego motion kind of find the chair kind of tasks. People have also used something related to spatial action maps for autonomous driving in the end-to-end interpretable neural motion planner. But what else could they be used for? There's a wide variety of tasks that are of the form, move your robot there and do an action. And so, is it the right representation for all these applications or not? That's just an open question. Okay, so I'll wrap up there and say thank you to the co-authors of this spatial action maps paper. Jimmy Wu was the lead on it, and then it was a collaboration between Princeton and Google. And then thank you very much to the MIT Princeton robotics team, which got us started in this direction, and our funding sources. The webpage is listed below. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for the great talk. So we got a number of questions for Tom's talk. Everyone's excited, but we only have time for one. But feel free to keep asking questions in the QA, and Tom will be back in the panel discussion. So feel free to ask more questions then. So we got one question from Hyungju Sa. These maps seem to take advantages of the planarity of the underlying environment and the pixel space. Can they generalize to 3D settings or deal with occlusions that may be present in 3D settings?
That's a great question. I think that the thing that's required is that the action space and the input space are pixel aligned, and I guess they could be voxels and voxel aligned. It's also possible that the input images could be, say, depth images even from a perspective view. Everything I showed you there was like from a bird's eye view. But if you had a depth image from even a first-person bird's eye view, I mean, like first-person robot view, still each pixel represents a location in space. And so you could perform a spatial action map of where your space of possible actions is moving to any location you can see. Yes, if the places you have to move and the ways you have to move them are much more complicated, then there's probably a limit to that.
Thank you. Let's thank Tom again, and we'll move on to the next session. Thanks.